Welcome to a new episode of First Laps from the Suzuka paddock after the media day for the Japanese Grand Prix. A media day that started with an FIA notification, an FIA message, or we should even say an FIA intervention. It's an intervention ahead of qualifying. They changed the amount of energy that drivers can recharge, so they can harvest during the qualifying session. More specifically, the amount was set on 9 megajoules a couple of weeks ago for Suzuka, and they kind of limited it now to 8 megajoules. The ultimate goal of that is to limit the amount of super clipping and limit the amount of lift and coast going on during a flying lap in qualifying. Usually for changes like that, they have to notify the teams 4 weeks in advance. Now they only did it last Tuesday, so that's a big difference. But there is some background to that, and the background relates back to the meeting that all teams had with the FIA after China. That was kind of the planned evaluation of the new technical regulations, so the evaluation of the first 2 weekends. And basically the consensus of the meeting was that the races itself are quite entertaining and, at least for now, do not need a knee-jerk reaction. But also the consensus was that qualifying is one element to look at, because qualifying is a lot about lifting, it's a lot about super clipping, it's a lot about sticking to the plan in terms of energy management, and it's not really about pushing and finding the ultimate limit. And that's what qualifying in Formula 1 should be all about. So most teams and also the drivers agree that qualifying has to change. But then the next question is, what's the time frame? And basically coming out of the meeting, everyone said, okay, no changes for Japan. We will use the break, the gap between Suzuka and Miami, to do more research and then to come up with some qualifying changes starting in Miami. But after that, the FIA changed their minds a little bit, because the FIA went back to the simulations for this weekend. So the simulations they got from teams for the Suzuka track. And the recent simulations looked a bit worse than anticipated. To be more precise, based on those simulations, the FIA expected 10 seconds of super clipping per lap. So that's a qualifying lap. And of course, that would not be a good look, especially with Melbourne in the back of our minds. Melbourne, the onboards of Albert Park looked a bit painful, especially towards turn 9 and 10. Used to be a challenging chicane for the drivers, but with super clipping, they lost a lot of speed before they even got to the braking zone. So the ultimate driver challenge was basically gone in those corners. And that would be similar in Suzuka. So they thought it would be good to limit the amount of energy that drivers can harvest. And according to the FIA, that should also limit the amount of super clipping from 10 seconds per lap to 6 seconds per lap. Of course, it does come at a certain price, because having less energy to harvest and also less energy to deploy means that the cars will be slower and that lap times will go up. But the FIA estimates that the lap times will go up only by half a second in qualifying. And then they think the trade-off, so 4 seconds less of super clipping, lap times only going up half a second, that the trade-off is kind of, worthwhile doing. And that's why on Tuesday they put this proposal to the teams and said, okay, we will only go ahead if you guys all agree. And that's what happened, and that's why they came up with a change for qualifying. Still, it remains to be seen how big the effect will be on Saturday, because drivers said, well, all our simulator work, Alexander Albon said, it can go into the toilet now, because we all did that based on the 9 megajoules, and now with 8 that's going to be different. So everyone needs to adapt already on Friday, kind of learning and adapting to the new reality. But all drivers basically say, well, maybe it gets rid of some super clipping, maybe it gets rid of some lift and coast, but it will not solve all the issues for qualifying. It will not bring back the ultimate challenge of Suzuka that we had with the ground effect cars. Because still the S's, so the iconic S's, and also corners like Spoon and the 130R might all be more about energy management than it ever has been before. So still, it cannot be compared with last year. That's the reality of the moment, and that reality cannot be changed, at least not for this season. So the fundamentals of the racks will also not be changed ahead of Miami. But they at least try to make it a little bit more acceptable for all parties involved this weekend. Then when it comes to the actual media day, the most remarkable moment happened behind me in the Red Bull hospitality area. Max Verstappen did his session with the written media, And the chairs are located a bit different than what they are now, because for the media sessions they will make it press conference setting. That means that the journalist can sit down and there will be one microphone for the one asking the questions. But the microphone was at one side of the room, and Max kept looking, before we started, he kept looking at the other side. And soon it became clear why, because when one of my colleagues was about to ask the first question, Max said, well, I'm not speaking until he leaves the room. And that was pointed at one journalist from The Guardian. And Max basically wanted him to leave the hospitality before the media session started. There's some background to it that goes back to Abu Dhabi last year. The very last day, the very last press conference of the 2025 season, when that journalist asked Max about the moment with George Russell in Barcelona and how painful that has been in hindsight, missing those points, etc. And already in Abu Dhabi, clearly Max did not like the question, because he said, yeah, I knew that it would come up. There are so many moments of my F1 season to talk about, but I knew someone would bring this up, and also with the grin on your face, that's what he said. So clearly Max didn't like it at the time, and apparently he didn't forget it in, let's say, the past almost 5 months. Someone pointed out to me that 109 days have passed since the press conference in Abu Dhabi. But still, Max Verstappen said today, when he saw him, I will only start my media sessions after he left the hospitality. So after that, kind of the journalist walked to the desk to pick up his voice recorder and said, Max, are you serious? Is this really about what happened in Abu Dhabi? And Max said, yes. And then he said, get out. That's what happened. So the journalist got out, and then Max commented, okay, now we can start. So that was a remarkable moment. Everyone in the room basically looking at each other and not quite sure what was going on. But after that, Max Verstappen started his media session, and a lot of that was on the Nürburgring, so the NLS adventure that he had last weekend. Of course, Max won in a Mercedes GT3 car, but then got disqualified after because his team used 7 sets of tires instead of 6. Max said, okay, that was a shame, but still there were 2 more important bits going into the weekend. First element was to learn for the 24 hours. And that learning still happened. Max even joked. He said, well, hopefully everyone and the whole team is now on point for the 24 hours after that mistake. And secondly, Max wanted to enjoy himself in a GT3 race even more, because he's not really enjoying Formula 1 under these regulations. And also clearly, no matter the disqualification, he still enjoyed himself at the Nürburgring. So that's one element. The second is that after that, even after flying to Japan, he had another outing, and this time in a Super GT car. That was at Fuji, and in slightly worse weather conditions. It was raining non-stop. But Max said also that was a lot of fun. He clarified, or basically his PR people clarified that was a content shoot for Red Bull Japan, but still Max had a lot of fun. But today and also this weekend, he's back to reality of Formula 1. And that reality has not been really positive for Red Bull Racing so far. The first 2 weekends have not gone according to plan. They have done some analysis after China, so they hope to bounce back and also to have solved the reliability issues. But still, they are looking forward to the break after this race weekend. Because Max said, when I asked him today, he said, well, that break can actually be quite positive for us. We have a bit more time to look at the data and hopefully to come back stronger in Miami. Isaac Hadjar said, well, yes, that's one thing. And the other thing is we have 2 races less with the car as it is now, because that car is not really great compared to at least Mercedes and Ferrari. So Red Bull looking to bounce back, but then especially looking to use the gap after Suzuka. Another team looking to bounce back is McLaren. Double DNS in China, really painful one. Oscar Piastri has not even done a racing lap on a Sunday so far. And today the team clarified that the double DNS was, as we expected, related to the Mercedes power unit, more specifically related to the battery, but it were 2 separate battery issues. So they had an investigation together with Mercedes HPP, found 2 battery issues not related to each other, but they hope to have fixed it for this weekend. Still, also McLaren, one of the teams lacking a bit of pace. Lando said at the moment we are the 3rd fastest team, and that means that they are still hoping for, last week I already mentioned the 2023 scenario, but Lando is still hopeful for a 2024 scenario, meaning that even though they started on the back foot with car development, they still hope to challenge for, let's say, a title. In 24, it was a constructors title. Later on, for now, that title fight is between two teams, Mercedes and Ferrari. But Charles Leclerc said, well, we should not get too excited about the fight because in his opinion, Ferrari is not as close as some people might think. He said it's basically related to the regulations and the yo-yo racing that we have. So if you pass someone, you run out of battery, and the other one that can counter you on the very next straight. So Charles said that yo-yo racing makes it really difficult for Mercedes to break free. But once they do, they still have a significant gap. And Charles thinks that the gap is half a second per lap. So he said Ferrari maybe not as competitive as some people might expect. Even though at this track it might be slightly different, because Lewis Hamilton pointed out today that the big part of the Mercedes advantage might be in the SM zone, so the straight mode zones. George Russell commented to that and said, well, maybe that's true, but maybe it's not just the straight mode zones, maybe just all the straights, because he said we have quite a low drag package, so we are quite good on all the straights. But Suzuka, that might be less of a factor than, let's say, China or especially Melbourne. Even more, Ferrari has the advantage of the really competitive and good starts. And overtaking has always been quite challenging around here. Still with all the yo-yo effect and also the artificial overtakes. It might be completely different this season. But if Ferrari can once again have a good start on Sunday, and maybe overtaking is more difficult than what it was in, let's say, China, then the picture here might be a bit more interesting. One final element that came up is about the Mercedes active aerodynamics. Because we've had the whole compression ratio discussion. That's kind of settled for now, but ahead of this weekend, a new topic came up, and that was Ferrari raising some questions about the Mercedes active aero, especially how the wing closed at the end of the straights. And it seemed to go in two stages at Mercedes in China. And some people thought it might be exploiting a gray area of the regulations. Today we talked to some people, and both Mercedes but also the FIA said, well, it was not that. It was basically a reliability issue and not so much Mercedes exploiting a gray area of the regulation. So that has been clarified for now. Let's see what the rest of the weekend brings, starting tomorrow with a free practice at this iconic venue. So we'll be back after FP2 with a new episode of First Laps. So hope to see you again tomorrow. And for now, thanks a lot for watching.